Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog, and today I'm going to teach you how to correct mistakes in your knitting by laddering down adjacent columns of stitches. This is an advanced tutorial because today I'm going to be correcting mistakes in a more intricate stitch pattern that has knits, purls, increases, and decreases. If you're new to this idea of laddering down columns, I have another video that is an introduction to the concept, and it's demonstrated with just simple knits and purls. I'll include a link to the video in the description below, as well as in the card in the upper corner of this video. Today I'm going to be demonstrating on a swatch that I made following this stitch chart. Unfortunately, I made a mistake in my swatch, and let's zoom in and look at it. Right here in my swatch, somehow I mixed up a knit two together and a yarn over. The knit two together should have been over here, and the yarn over should have been over here. That would have given me a nice slant along the edge of the pattern, which I don't have, and a nice series of yarn overs and open lacy work, which again didn't happen. Instead of frogging or ripping out rows and rows of stitches to get back to where I made the mistake, I'm going to focus just on a small section of my knitting. I'm going to drop a few stitches off my knitting needles, ladder down or unravel back to where the mistake happened, and then I'm going to rework the stitches following my stitch chart. Some helpful tools when you're correcting a mistake like this. First, you're going to need a knitting needle that is slightly smaller than the needles you're working on. It's also helpful to use a crochet hook that is slightly smaller than the needles you're working on. Technically, you could just use knitting needles to reknit your work. However, a crochet hook makes it a little bit easier to manipulate the stitches. If you want to know why, again, check out the introduction video I mentioned earlier. I'm using an addi Duett here because it has a hook on one end and the knitting needle on the other. Another tool you'll need is a DPN or a knitting needle that is the same size as the set that you're working on. It also can be helpful to have a locking stitch marker and some sticky notes to help you keep track of your place in your chart. When you're correcting mistakes by laddering down like this, I highly recommend that you work on a flat surface like a table, not your lap. It just gives you a little bit more stability and support as you're fixing your mistakes. Let's get started. Before we start ripping things out, let's get oriented. When you are laddering down columns, it's very helpful to work with the right side of your knitting facing you. This makes it easier to read your stitches and understand what's happening. Also, know your row. I know that this top row of stitches that I just worked is row 8 of my stitch pattern. This is going to help us out a little bit later. Also, we need to know how far to rip down, where our mistake happened. I'm going to zoom in again. And like I said before, I switched a yarn over and a knit two together. So my mistake happened right here. So I need to rip down to this row of stitches that's across here. I'm going to put a stitch marker through one of these stitches so I can remember how far to rip down to. I'm actually going to go through both today, I think. And lock it in place. And this will just help be my guide as I drop stitches and start unraveling, so I know how far to go and don't rip out any further than I need to. Now I need to position my needles so that I can start dropping stitches. You want to work or slip your stitches so that the first stitch you're going to drop is at the tip of your left hand needle. So first we need to figure out what's the first stitch we need to drop. My mistake was here where this yarn over was and the knit two together is. And if I follow from the yarn over up my column of stitches, this is the first stitch that I need to drop off my needle so that all of these can unravel back down to where my mistake was. And since I'm looking at how far I need to unravel and which stitches need to be unraveled, let's go on the other side of the mistake. Here's the two stitches that were knit together. If I follow the second stitch in that knit two together up the column, this is the last stitch that I'm going to need to unravel. So basically I'm going to unravel everything between here and here. Those 5 stitches are going to get dropped off my needle and unraveled down. So let's get our knitting set up, and like I said, you can either work across to where you're going to start unraveling, or you can just slip the stitches. To help us keep this working yarn out of the way, I'm just going to slip the stitches out of my way. So these don't need to be unraveled. I'm going to move my marker that shows the beginning of my charted pattern, and this stitch does not need to be unraveled. Now I'm ready to drop 5 stitches off of my needles and unravel my work down. Before you start dropping stitches off your needle and start unraveling them down the columns, make sure to have your smaller knitting needle ready because you're going to need to get it back through your stitches after they've been undone. Sometimes you are lucky enough that you could put your knitting needle through the stitches before you start unraveling. And really, the example here today is a case that I could potentially get my knitting needle through the stitches. I want to start unraveling here, and it's down this column, and if I also follow where the mistake happened across, I could start picking up stitches onto my knitting needle here, making sure that the right leg of the stitch is at the front of the needle, and work my way across, again making sure that the right leg is at the front of the needle. One more, and then these 2 that I knit together. And in this case, I could take my 5 stitches, drop them off this top needle, unravel down to here, and it would stop unraveling right where my knitting needle is. However, that's not always the case. Sometimes you just simply cannot get this knitting needle into your work before you start unraveling. So let's take a look at what would happen if that were the case. So I'm going to take the knitting needle out. We're going to drop off our 5 stitches up here at the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Let's zoom in. And now we're going to unravel those stitches back down to this row where the marker is. And I'm going to use my other knitting needle. Well, first let's pull this through so nothing more falls off our needles at the top. And then I'm just going to use my knitting needle to gently pull the yarn and unravel back down to where our marker is. And then this is the last group of stitches that I am unraveling. So there are my 5 stitches that I need to get back onto my knitting needle. And you can see if I am not touching anything here, my stitches aren't going to unravel any further. So you can take a deep breath, and now let's get these 5 stitches back onto our knitting needles. And at this point, I'm not going to worry how they're mounted. We're going to fix that in a minute. I just want to get my knitting needle through these 5 stitches any way I can, and it doesn't matter how they're mounted. So we're just going to get the needle right through the center of each stitch so they don't unravel any further. And these last two where my stitch marker is are pretty easy. Once the stitches are back on my knitting needles, I'm going to remove this locking stitch marker because now I know where to ravel down to, and I'm there. And now that they're on my needles, we're going to check and make sure that they're mounted properly before we go any further. Now we need to make sure that our stitches are mounted properly before we start re-knitting our work. Every stitch in knitting has a right hand leg and a left hand leg. Conventionally, this right hand leg is the one that is mounted at the front of your knitting needle for both knits and for purls. So we need to transfer our stitches from our smaller needle onto our larger one, making sure they're mounted properly. And this is also going to help make sure that they're sized properly. If we open up and look at this first stitch, it looks like it's fine. The right hand leg is at the front of the needle, so I'm going to slip it over without twisting. And the second stitch also, the right hand leg is at the front of the needle, so we're going to slip it over. The next stitch, however, isn't mounted properly. This time I have the left hand leg at the front of the needle and the right's at the back, so we're just going to twist it so that the right hand leg is at the front. The next one is mounted properly. The right hand leg is at the front. And the last stitch is twisted. The left is at the front, so we're just going to turn it and get it mounted properly. And now we're ready to start re-knitting our stitches. And we're going to work rung by rung up this ladder of stitches that we unraveled. Since I intentionally made a mistake in my knitting, I know that it happened in row 3. However, if you were knitting along and laddered down like this, you may not know what row this is that's on your knitting needle. Remember before I said that the last row that I worked had been row 8? That means that this top strand of the ladder is going to be used to re-knit row 8. The next strand down is for row 7. The next is for row 6, row 5, row 4, and this bottom rung of the ladder is going to be for row 3 of the knitting. I'm just going to hold that out of the way for a moment. Now that I know that I'm on row 3 of my pattern, I can use a sticky note to mark row 3 of the chart. I also know that I unraveled 5 stitches that started right after this column of purls. So I unraveled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, and this last column of knits I didn't touch, and you can see that actually here in my work. This is that last column of knits before the purls. So I could also put a sticky note here to help me keep track of where I am. And if I wanted to, I could put another sticky note here because these are the stitches we're focused on re-knitting. However, if I do that, it's going to cover up my row numbers also. And I don't necessarily want to do that. So for now, I'm going to leave it like that. And we'll scoot the pattern up and out of the way. And now we're ready to start re-knitting our stitches. So I'm working with this lowest strand that unraveled from the ladder. And I am going to knit, knit, knit 2 together, knit, yarn over in this first row. As I'm working, I'm just going to treat this crochet hook like it was a knitting needle. I'm just using the hook on the end as a tool to help me manipulate the yarn. So I need to knit that first stitch. I'm going to insert the hook knitwise through the stitch, just as if it was my right hand needle. And then I'm going to wrap the yarn counterclockwise around the hook and pull it through. And you wrap counterclockwise for both knits and for purls. I don't know that I'm going to have any knits to show you here. My next stitch is a knit. So insert the hook knitwise, wrap counterclockwise and pull it through. Knit 2 together. So I'm going to insert my hook through 2 stitches knitwise, wrap counterclockwise and pull it through. Knit 1 more. And then I need to do a yarn over, which just means I need to pull this strand forward and then go over my right hand needle, which is in this case my hook. We still have a pretty good length of yarn over here, so we are going to transfer our stitches back onto our regular size knitting needle, and we're also going to kind of redistribute the yarn across the row to make sure our stitches are evenly sized. This time we don't have to worry so much about mounting. Since we knitted the stitches, they're already properly mounted. I'm just going to slip them from my hook onto my needle. You can kind of pull that length of yarn to distribute it evenly across the row as we go. We finished row 3, so let's move our sticky note up. Looks like for the next row we're just going to knit all the stitches. Find the lowest strand of this rungs of the ladder. And there's the lowest strand. That's what I'm going to use to knit the next row. Insert your hook knitwise through the next stitch, wrap counterclockwise, and pull it through. And work across those 5 stitches. Again, you can see we have quite a bit of yarn left on this side. So as we transfer our stitches back onto the regular size needle, we're just going to distribute that yarn across. Move up a row of stitches. This time I'm going to knit, knit 2 together, knit, yarn over, knit. Locate the lowest strand here. That's right here. We'll use that to work our stitches across. Transfer the stitches back onto the regular size needle and redistribute the yarn across because that side is pretty loose. Move up a row in the pattern. Knit across all the stitches. So again, find the lowest strand, which is this one, and use it to knit. Whoop. Let's not lose those. Knit across those 5 stitches. Redistribute the yarn and transfer back to the regular size needle. Move up a row. Knit 2 together, knit, yarn over, knit, knit. Find the lowest rung of the ladder, which is this one. Work the stitches. Transfer and redistribute the yarn. Move up a row, and we're on that very last row, and it's all knits. So there's only 1 rung of our ladder left. That's what we'll use. And this time, as we're redistributing this last 5 stitches back, we can actually put them back onto the regular needles that we've been using to knit our piece. So let's slide them back and redistribute that length of yarn across. And now we can slide these last 3 stitches back onto our regular needles. Lay things out, and now you can see everything's been fixed. We got rid of that weird yarn over we had over here. We have the same slant here that we do here. And we have our nice lacy series of yarn overs right here, just like right here. And we're ready to continue knitting our piece, and our mistake has been fixed. I hope that learning how to correct mistakes by laddering down columns of stitches and reworking them gave you a little bit more confidence to correct mistakes in your own knitting. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!